The morning air in Montgomery, Alabama, was thick with humidity as Elliot Carter rushed up the courthouse steps. He checked his watch, 8:47 a.m. He was late. Elliot, a federal prosecutor, had spent the early hours of the morning at a human trafficking hearing, a case that could determine the fate of several victims. He had intended to leave earlier, but unexpected testimonies delayed him. Now, he found himself hurrying into Montgomery Municipal Court, still dressed in his sharp navy blue suit, a briefcase in hand. As he entered courtroom 3, all eyes turned to him. The room was silent, except for the faint shuffling of papers and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. Seated at the bench was Judge Martin Holloway, a man in his late 60s, with a stern expression and a reputation for zero tolerance for disruptions. Elliot moved quickly to his seat at the prosecution's table, but before he could settle in, Holloway's cold voice cut through the air. "Mr. Carter, do you realize what time it is?" Elliot turned to face the judge, his tone calm but firm. "I apologize, Your Honor. I was held up at a federal hearing. I did not ask for excuses." Holloway leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Tardiness in my courtroom is unacceptable. You will be fined $750 for your delay." A murmur rippled through the room. Elliot's brows furrowed slightly. He had never been fined for being late before. Judges often exercise discretion, especially when the tardiness was due to another legal proceeding. But before he could respond, Holloway raised a hand. "And let this be a warning. My courtroom operates on discipline, not leniency." Elliot nodded once, suppressing his irritation. He glanced around the room. The reaction from the other attorneys and clerks was oddly subdued. Some avoided eye contact. Others exchanged brief glances, but said nothing. He noted something strange. He had seen other attorneys walk in late before, yet none had ever been fined so harshly. As the hearing proceeded, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an unspoken tension in the air, something deeper than a simple fine. And though he didn't know it yet, this small moment of unfairness would lead him to uncover a much greater injustice. The hearing had ended, but the tension still clung to Elliot like a shadow. He stepped out of the courtroom, his mind replaying the moment Judge Holloway had so swiftly fined him. As he walked through the courthouse corridors, a voice called out behind him, "Rough morning?" Elliot turned to see Michael Lawson, a public defender he had met a few times before. A man in his 40s, sharp-minded but visibly worn by years in the system. Elliot exhaled sharply. "You could say that." Michael smirked. "Let me guess, Holloway." Elliot nodded. "Does he always do that?" Michael let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Not to everyone. Just the ones he doesn't like." Elliot narrowed his eyes. "And who exactly doesn't he like?" Michael sighed, leaning in slightly. "People like you, Carter. And defendants who look a certain way." Elliot's expression hardened. He knew what Michael meant. "You think he's biased?" Elliot asked, lowering his voice. Michael scoffed. "I don't think I know. The numbers don't lie." Holloway hands out sentences, like candy, except some people get poison, while others walk away with a slap on the wrist. Before Elliot could respond, another voice broke in. "You're not the first." Elliot turned to see Samuel Price, an older courthouse security guard standing near the doorway. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his face lined with years of observation. "Excuse me?" Elliot asked. Samuel glanced around before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "You're not the first person he's tried to humiliate, and you won't be the last." Elliot studied the man carefully. "You've seen this before?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I've worked here for 20 years. I've seen him go easy on guys who look like him, and destroy the ones who don't." Elliot felt a slow burn in his chest. This wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger. Michael sighed. "Look, Carter, I know you're a federal guy, but if you're planning to do something about this, you better be sure. Holloway isn't just some bad judge, he's a fixture. People look the other way, even when they know he's wrong. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the closed doors of courtroom 3, where Judge Holloway still sat, passing judgment. For the first time that day, Elliot felt something stronger than frustration. He felt determination. This wasn't over. Not even close. That night, Elliot sat in his dimly lit office, scrolling through case files on his laptop. The more he thought about Holloway's courtroom, the more certain he became. This wasn't just a one-time incident. He needed proof. Elliot picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Within moments, a voice answered. "Carter, why are you calling me at this hour?" It was Olivia Barnes, his superior at the federal prosecutor's office. A sharp-minded woman in her 50s, Olivia had spent decades fighting corruption. "I need a favor," Elliot said. "I need case records from Montgomery Municipal Court, specifically Judge Holloway's rulings over the past 10 years. There was a brief silence. Then Olivia sighed. "This isn't going to be easy. Municipal records aren't exactly organized, and Holloway has friends in high places." Elliot leaned forward. "I don't care how hard it is. If I'm right about this, we're looking at a serious violation of judicial ethics." Another pause. Then Olivia said, "I'll see what I can do." Days later, Olivia met Elliot in a quiet office at the federal building. A thick folder of case files sat between them. "You were right," she said, flipping open a report. "We ran the numbers. The pattern is clear." Elliot scanned the document. His jaw tightened as he read the statistics. Black defendants were 3 times more likely to receive harsher sentences than white defendants for the same crimes. White defendants were significantly more likely to receive plea deals or reduced sentences. Public defenders who challenged Holloway's decisions often found their motions dismissed without consideration. Several lawyers who had spoken out against Holloway had mysteriously lost cases, been denied hearings, or faced professional setbacks. Elliot clenched his fists. This wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate. Later that afternoon, Elliot made his way back to Montgomery Municipal Court. He had arranged to meet with Margaret Lawson, the court's longtime clerk. It's time people knew the truth. But when he entered her office, she looked nervous. She barely glanced at him as she shuffled papers on her desk. "Mr. Carter, I really shouldn't be talking to you." Elliot lowered his voice. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to do anything illegal, but you've been working under Holloway for years. You've seen what he's done. You know this isn't right." Margaret hesitated, then glanced at the door. "If he finds out I helped you, I could lose my job." Elliot met her gaze. "And if we don't do something, how many more people will lose their freedom?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached into a drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and slid it across the desk. "I can't say anything," she murmured, "but maybe these might help." Elliot picked up the envelope. Inside were court transcripts, sentencing records, and internal memos, all documenting Holloway's blatant bias over the years. He exhaled sharply. This was it. The evidence he needed. But as he left the office, a chilling realization settled over him. If Holloway had gone this far to protect his power, what would he do to keep it from crumbling? This was only the beginning. Elliot sat across from Olivia in a quiet, windowless office at the federal courthouse. The weight of the sealed complaint between them was almost tangible. "Are we ready for this?" Olivia asked, scanning the documents one last time. Elliot's jaw tightened. "If we don't do this now, how many more lives will be destroyed?" Olivia gave a small nod, then slid the folder into a large official envelope. It was addressed to the Judicial Review Commission, the body responsible for investigating misconduct among judges. This was it. The first real step toward justice. The League. They expected the commission to take weeks, maybe months, to process the complaint. They were wrong. Just 3 days later, the story broke. Someone inside the commission had leaked details of the case to the press. The Montgomery Tribune ran the first article. Judge Martin Holloway, accused of racial bias in sentencing. Federal prosecutor speaks out. By the end of the day, major news networks had picked it up. CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The headlines were relentless. Justice or prejudice. Inside the courtroom of Judge Holloway, the numbers don't lie. How one judge rigged the system. Calls for resignation. As Montgomery judge faces scrutiny. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, shoving microphones into the faces of lawyers, clerks, and even courthouse security. Samuel Price, the longtime courthouse guard, watched from a distance and muttered, "About time." Holloway fights back. Judge Holloway wasn't going down without a fight. At a press conference, he stood behind a podium, flanked by his attorneys. He looked directly into the cameras, his face a mask of controlled indignation. "These accusations are baseless. I have always ruled according to the law. This is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by individuals who wish to see me removed for their own political gain." The words were measured, but the cracks were showing. A reporter raised her hand. "Judge Holloway, what do you say to the data showing clear racial disparities in your sentencing?" He stiffened. "Statistics can be manipulated. Every case is different. I stand by my record." Another journalist called out. "Several attorneys claim you intimidated them when they questioned your rulings. Do you deny this?" His jaw clenched. The cameras caught the flicker of anger in his eyes. "I have nothing more to say." And with that, he walked off the stage. The investigation begins. Despite Holloway's public defense, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal investigation. Internal audits of his courtroom were ordered. Dozens of case files were pulled for review. Former defendants, attorneys, and court employees were called in for testimony. And then, the biggest blow came. Margaret Lawson, the longtime court clerk, agreed to testify. When reporters found her, she only had one thing to say. It's time people knew the truth. Holloway wasn't just in trouble. He was cornered. News of the investigation spread like wildfire. The public was outraged. Human rights organizations, bar associations, and even fellow judges began asking the same question. How did this go unnoticed for decades? A petition calling for Holloway's removal gathered over 50,000 signatures in just 3 days. For Elliott, the phone never stopped ringing. Journalists, colleagues, even former defendants who had suffered under Holloway wanted to talk. At a small cafe near the courthouse, Samuel Price set down a newspaper and looked straight at Elliott. "You did what no one else dared to do in the last 20 years. Elliott shook his head. But how many cases were already mishandled? How many lives were ruined? 2 weeks later, Holloway announced his resignation. In a letter to the Judicial Review Commission, he did not admit any wrongdoing. Instead, he claimed he was stepping down to preserve the integrity of the court. But everyone knew the truth. He resigned to avoid a public hearing. The day Holloway walked out of the courthouse for the last time, the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, closing a dark chapter in Montgomery's judicial history. Even after winning, Elliott couldn't feel victorious. Justice had prevailed. But was it too late? How many innocent people had been sentenced unfairly because no one had spoken up? And more importantly, how many other Holloways were still sitting on the bench? The Holloway case sent shockwaves through the legal system. The scandal had exposed a deeper flaw. Holloway wasn't just one corrupt judge. He was a symptom of a much larger problem. In response, reforms were put into motion. Judges across the state were now required to undergo bias training to recognize and address implicit prejudices in their rulings. An independent oversight committee was established to monitor sentencing patterns and ensure fairness in the courtroom. A full-scale audit of past city court rulings in Alabama began uncovering dozens of cases that needed reconsideration. Elliott didn't stop there. The case had changed him. He refused to let this be a one-time victory. He began working with civil rights groups, legal reform advocates, and lawmakers, pushing for nationwide changes in the judicial system. One evening, standing before a crowd at a legal conference, Elliot looked at the faces before him: judges, lawyers, activists, students. With conviction in his voice, he delivered a simple but powerful message. Justice is not just about following the law. It's about making sure the law is applied fairly. The room fell silent for a moment. Then the applause began, and Elliot knew this fight was only just beginning.